Hello, this is Elaine. You're listening to Think on This.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to Think on This. I'm in 1 Peter chapter 2, and I'm going to read verses 20 and 21. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. I heard a preacher say, the only thing you gain by sinning is more sin. And sin's ultimate final stamp on your life will be death. You only get death and more suffering. But when you suffer for the sake of obedience to the Lord by submitting to your master, it's showing God manifesting his grace in your life. You can't do that. You can't live gracefully without impacting those who treat you poorly. So much so they can be won over by the grace of God that's showing in your life. They can be converted. They can be changed through your response to their unjust treatment. Once again, we're reminded of the greatest example, Jesus Christ, who, he suffered more so in the same manner. He died at our hand because of our sin. We dealt him the greatest injustice. We deserve death and hell, but he took it on himself. He showed us mercy and gave us grace. He favored us, though we despised him. We had no desire for righteousness, and that's what he came in. And it was his righteousness that would save us, not our own. All his efforts were for our benefit. And I don't know about you, but that moves me to the core, because we have a perfect example of how poor treatment, and it happens all the time in our world, but we have an example of poor treatment being put on someone who took it and gave, not in kind, but gave in love. And that's amazing. That's amazing, and that should move us. But like I can go on and on. He favored us, though we despised him. All his efforts were for our benefit. Now, if you're a Christian, you have no better example to look on how we should behave towards our leaders than that of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Remember, Peter's talking about how to deal with the authority, how to subject ourselves. And in today's society, you've got leaders, and then you have employers, and lawmakers and all that, and police officers. There's authority. There is authority. There are leaders. And these principles that we're seeing here should be applied to how we treat them, even when we're facing unjust treatment by these people. Obviously, in our nation today, like I said, slavery is frowned upon. People are about equal rights. If at any point our rights are violated, usually there's rebellion. In the workplace, people will strike if the business treats them in the way they don't like to be treated. If they're not getting enough pay, if the work hours are horrible. While this might be an acceptable attitude to have in society, it has no room in the church. It should not be characteristic of a Christian to behave this way. It is not Christ-like. It is the opposite of Christ-likeness. In fact, when we claim to be a Christian and treat people in the same manner they treat us when it's unjust, we're not improving our testimony. We're not improving our testimony. We're making it worse. Our vigilant rebellion will undo our testimony. And that's what Peter means when he asks, for what credit is it if when you sin and you're beaten for it, you endure? There is nothing to gain in rebellion, especially when God does not honor that behavior. We do God a dishonor with this attitude. We need to keep our behavior excellent to the rest of the world. When they see nothing but a good heart that seeks to glorify God, that will be the impact that makes a difference, and hopefully will lead them to Christ. But you have to endure in that. You have to deal with the unjust treatment in a way that honors God. Remember, Peter is writing to slaves. He had slaves in his church. They didn't have freedom. There was no chance they could have freedom. They couldn't possess property without the consent of their master, and even so, it would be their master's before it was theirs. There was no civil court to take their case to. And what does Peter say? He's not saying, all right, slaves, run away, be free. He's saying, submit. He simply tells them to faithfully submit. It pleases God for the role that they're in if they fulfill it, doing with an attitude that honors and glorifies him. And don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating slavery. I believe slavery is a great evil, but they had slaves back in Peter's time. The Roman Empire thrived on slavery because most of the workforce were slaves. And slavery, obviously, the connotation of slavery in the Roman Empire versus what it was like during the American Civil War, those are a little bit different. Nevertheless, it's the same, they're fulfilling the same role, but slaves were treated probably a little bit better during the Roman Empire, even though they didn't have any more rights than slaves during the American Revolution, or not the American Revolution, sorry, the Civil War. It's like, don't take that as an ignorant statement. I just wasn't thinking on it before I said that. But think about who Peter's talking to. He tells them to faithfully submit. It pleases God. So if you're in a role in life and you claim to be a Christian and you hate your role in life, you need to do a little self-examination, especially in conjunction with this passage. And you need to pray that God opens your eyes to the right behavior. You need to pray that he'll point you to what ultimately honors and glorifies him, how you act, how you talk, especially to your authority. That's the big thing. How are we going to respond to authority, even when they treat us poorly? Well, we have the example of what Jesus did, and we have other examples, and I talked about this yesterday. David and Joseph, and then many others who just went through some seriously troublesome conditions that were brought about by people above them. And Joseph obviously was on equal ground with his brothers, and they were jealous of the authority that Joseph would one day have. But then Joseph ends up with in Potiphar's house as his servant and ranks all the way up to the top. But then Potiphar's wife desires to have sexual relations with him. He refuses outright, and then he was dealt unjustly, even though he did the right thing. But God saw him through and blessed him for it. You have David, who was despised by Saul because David would eventually become king, and Saul would be phased out, and no one in his line would have that opportunity. Well, Saul was jealous. He tried to kill David, and David did not respond in kind. He, in fact, would bow humbly before Saul whenever he interacted with him, even after the worst of those situations. And we have some good examples in the Bible that show us the proper way to respond to unjust treatment by our leaders. And it's not what most people would do. So we need to be mindful of that. We need to be mindful of how we should respond to our leaders in a Christ-like biblical way. This is Robert Caudell with Think on This. Thank you for listening.